Well, welcome back to our third session for our annual lectureship. We're so glad to have Dr. Ortiz here. We've had two great stimulating lectures already. Just one quick announcement. There are a number of our students that are actually taking the lectureship for academic credit. And one of the privileges of being enrolled in the course is having an individual private session with Dr. Ortiz directly after this lecture today. That will happen in classroom 113, so those of you who are here will need to move down to 113 afterwards, and so I'll ask all of the rest of our guests maybe to look for another time to engage Dr. Ortiz in conversation afterwards so that he can get down and spend class time with the students. For those students who are joining us online, you should have an email in your inbox that'll have a Zoom link. So some students will be joining virtually this afternoon too. So we look very much forward to hearing about the Exodus. So Dr. Ortiz, the classroom is yours.
A little confused. You should be. Some of you look like this person here. But the first two are I put a lot in. It's the method and theory. But now for the next three, you're going to see the method to my madness as I start talking about the historicity of three events within the Bible. So we'll start off. We have a lot with the Exodus, and I'm sure the student session we can hash out a lot of more details, but since I have the mic, I get to hold to the view that I hold, which I think is the biblical view, but some of my colleagues have a heretical view, but we'll discuss that. As I said, most of us have a caricature of the Exodus. Charlton Heston really did a number because everybody wants to see that in the archaeological record because that's what they see on TV, and VeggieTales also contributes to that. Data. There are 4 texts in the Bible that biblical historians use for dating the Exodus. 1 Kings 6:1. In the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. So this is good history. It's linear. It gives us data. It gives us dates. And so we take 480 years. You can guesstimate when Solomon built his temple, his 4th year. We come sometime to 1446. Judges 1126 BC. While Israel lived in Heshbon and its villages, and Ariar and its villages, and in all the cities that are on the banks of the Arnon, 300 years, why did you not deliver them at that time, within that time? Okay, so this is one of the judges describing this event. It's an estimate, about 300 years, we're not sure. But if you add, we kind of guess judges around 12th century, 11th century BC. Again, it comes down to the 15th century, 1446, give or take. Exodus 1:11. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. Now we have an actual proper noun, 2 proper nouns, geographical terms, but we know that they were being built by the Pharaoh and Pharaoh Ramses. Now, there are about 9 Ramses that were pharaohs, Ramses 1, 2, 3, all the way to 9. But there's only one of them that reigned long enough for the accounts of the Exodus, and that's Ramses II, 13th century. So the 13th century proponents say this is Ramses II, and that's the view that I hold. I think Ramses II was the pharaoh of the Exodus. Genesis 47:27. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt and the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it. They were fruitful and multiplied greatly. This gives us a geographical term. Goshen is the Egyptian delta. Now this is important because you're going to see, I'm going to show you the Egyptian pharaohs moved their capital back and forth. 18th dynasty had it up, south, but upper Egypt in terms of the heights, in around Thebes. The 19th dynasty had their capital down in Goshen, or the Delta. Now, in the Exodus account, you have Moses, God saying, tomorrow go to Pharaoh and say this. So the Hebrews were down in Goshen. It has to be a capital that Moses can go back and forth within a day's journey. I've backpacked up the Nile. It's not backpacking. You pay 10 cents, you get in a little back of a pickup truck, and you go to the next village. It's like a little taxi system. But some of us students with our backpacks would just start going up the Nile and stopping at archaeological sites they wanted to and just hopefully finding a hotel. It's about a 8-day journey to go from, Cairo, the Delta area, all the way up to Thebes. So this is another datum point. So basically, you have to look at these 4 texts, and if we put it within the context and the dating, the first 2 say that the Exodus happened in the 18th dynasty. Chronologic, this is where they fit. The second 2 fit the 19th dynasty. Now, no matter which position you hold, the biblical 13th century or the non-biblical 15th century, and I'm just joking with my colleagues who might hold to the 15th century date, but there's an apparent contradiction in God's word. How do we determine which date we place the Exodus? I'll cut to the chase. Whenever the Bible uses proper nouns, it's accurate historically. Whenever we have numbers in the Bible, we have to go through a whole process of interpretation or exegeting the text. We have a contradiction. Are there mistakes in the accounts? Naturally, if you're a critical scholar, you say, well, the Bible's made up, so it doesn't matter. Of course, they're going to have contradictions. I have to assume that all statements are true. I can't change the biblical text. So I have to come up with a historical reconstruction that accounts for all 4 texts. Basically, as I said, when there's proper nouns, I tend to hold that. When there's numbers, there's a lot more data we have to figure out. I'll just give you some quick examples. Hebrew versus Arabic. Hebrew does not have symbols for numbers. If I put up number 1, oh, that's a 1. If I put 1 and 2 together, oh, that's 12. Those are Arabic symbols, numbers. And we get our English system from the Arabic system, Arabic numerals. Hebrew only has alphabetic letters. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, A, B, C. And so number 1, it's a symbol for Aleph. So if you want to say, in 1 year, you're going to graduate, you put A. If you want to say, 10 years, you got to go through the whole alphabet. There's only 22 letters of the alphabet. So they have to change them. Now, I've been in synagogue and reading the Hebrew Bible, and I cannot find the text. So they'll say this chapter, I'll look, I go, okay, Dalet, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. I have to use my numbers, my toes. If you're doing like Isaiah 46, I go, okay, what's the number for 40? And I need a Hebrew Bible that has Arabic numeral systems. Now, the Israelis or the Jews in the temple, in the synagogue, they have no problem because they've been taught as kids to recognize that number. So in the Hebrew Bible, there's no numbers. In the English Bible, translators are generous and they don't want you to spend 10 minutes looking for the passage in the sermon. They put it there for you. Also, for example, Aleph. I said there's only 22 letters. Well, how do you write 1,000? Well, you use Aleph. So A means 1. A means 1,000. A means the sound and also we found out that A means, Aleph means a unit or military unit of men. And so historical sources, Egyptian sources, like, well, this is a unit of 20 to 30. We can debate how many men are in a unit. So by the context of the verse, we kind of figure out what they mean. If it says a woman gave birth to Aleph children, we go, wow, she either gave birth to 1 or 1,000. Where translators are pretty good and say, it's going to be 1. They're going to guess 1. I'm sure you don't have to know Hebrew to know. It's like you're going to say, yeah, one. We don't have 1,000 babies born. It gets tricky when you start to say how many people showed up. And are they talking about 1,000? Or are they talking about a unit of people or a clan or, a symbol like that? Calendar systems. We have at least a couple calendar systems in the Hebrew Bible. We have a religious calendar. It's like us if we decided Easter is the first month. So April will be month 1. You have a political calendar or secular calendar that starts in January. The Jews have both calendars, a religious calendar and they adopt the secular calendar. Muslims also have a religious calendar and a secular calendar. One is based off of the sun. One is based off of the lunar system, the moon. And we have leap year. We realize, okay, every 4 years, we got to add a day just to equal things out. If you have a lunar calendar, it's every, help me out here, probably 7 years, you have to add a second month to the calendar system. 4 times 30. Well, anyway, we lose a day every 4 years. They had to get 30 days, based off a lunar calendar. So you can see all of a sudden it gets complicated with numbers. And you have to guess, is David referring Solomon? Is this the religious month or the secular month? Measuring systems, same thing. We have the royal cubit and the common cubit. It's sort of, I'm driving here, and I go, I'm not speeding, but I'm using miles versus kilometers. So, I have to guess. I look at lunch, I go, man, that's expensive. Things are expensive. And I go, oh, wait, there's a different, the Canadian dollar is different than the US dollar. Because I'm an archaeologist, I convert to metric because we measure in metric. And when I have American students, and I say, it's, how long is that? I have to convert, go down about 10 centimeters. They're just lost, I go like this much, I go, 5 inches, I just, but we know this. And as archaeologists, we'll look at tombs. And sometimes the tombs, we can divide up the measurement and find out this is based on a royal cubit. Well, who will design their tomb off a royal cubit? Royalty. And so we know this is an important person. This is either one of the kings of Israel or perhaps one of the high priests because they're using the royal cubit. Same thing with the building of the temple. We can guess, well, that was built using the royal cubit. Ascension year. We had problems coordinating the reigns of the Hebrew kings. And there's one seminary student who did a master's thesis, Thiele, and he came up with this interpretation that we have 2 ascension years. So if you're a king and you come to the throne in July, well, from July to December, that's not your first year. Your first year starts in January. So you come to the throne in January, that's your first year. So the North might have that system. The South would have a system, if you come to the throne in December, that's your first year. And then 1 month later in January, well, that starts your second year. So you can see if in the text, King A comes to the throne in the third year of the reign of King B up in the north, you got some mix-ups there. And pretty much it matches up. The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings, his thesis became a book. A lot use it. We've adapted it and changed it as we know more information. But all of a sudden, he discovered this ascension year, and they cleaned up. There's one problem in the north. There was like 1 year that we had 4 kings because they kept killing each other. That was that Baptist year where fighting over who's going to rule. And so You have, 4 ascension years, the same time. But other than that, they pretty much coordinate. Math-based system. We have no idea what math-based system they used. Or, Abraham would have used 60. Mesopotamia, it's based on, 6, 60. We know there's 1. There's 10 ones in 10. There's 10 tens in 100. There's 10 hundreds in 1,000. Or math-based, 10-based system. And you can see it's getting confusing. The Egyptians had a 10-day week. The Hebrews had a 7-day week. Moses was an Egyptian. The slaves worked on the Egyptian system. So if your boss said, I'm going to pay you for 2 weeks' worth, you're going to say, I'm Jewish. I only want to work for 14 days versus, 20 days. And you have to come up with which system are you getting paid under. Cultural. We had a Bedouin guard to guard our equipment at Tal Gezer. And basically we have a storage container out, in the woods there, out in the fields, and he'd sleep there overnight to make sure nobody stole our equipment. We're basically paying the Bedouin not to steal our equipment because he knew the tribes there. And so that was, bakshish, just like you pay, the mafia not to rob you, you get security there. Well, we'd negotiate, a salary, how much to pay him. And I'd get talking to him, and how many children do you have? I have 6 kids. Mabruk, God has blessed you. And we talk about his kids. Month later, when I go to pay him, he'd say, I need more money. I go like, no, we negotiated, so many sheklim. And he goes, yes, but my family. I go, we negotiated. He goes, I have 10 kids. And I go, what do you mean you have 10? You told me you have 6. He goes, well, yeah, 6 boys. And so, he only counted the boys when he wanted to talk about his kids. But he knew he had 4 daughters. Well, that's cultural. It's sort of like, who are the important, I have 4. And he knew the system. Culturally, as a Bedouin, Muslim, that this is, boys are important. But he knew as an American, yeah, but you count the girls too, so I'm going to, try to get more out of you and tell you about my larger family. I remember the first time I was in Sinai. We had a Scandinavian who lived there, anthropologist. And so, he knew Arabic and Bedouin culture, and he was our guide. Well, we arranged to have, there was about like 32 of us. We arranged to have 32 camels so we can all sit on and go through Sinai. That morning, they drop us off at the head of the wadi, and he fought with them for like 4 hours. And he finally came back and he said, look, we only have 30 camels. He goes, I negotiated for 32. But there's really no number for 32. It's sort of like at some point you say a lot. He goes, so legally, they provided a lot of camels. And he goes, this is just cultural. There's just no, at some point you bring enough. And for them, they said, we brought you what we negotiated. So he said, 2 of us are going to have to walk and switch off, Now, if you've ridden a camel, since I was younger at the time, I volunteered to walk. I did ride a camel, but our Western behinds are not built for these, beasts of burden there. At the end of the trip, they had Bedouin jewelry. And I go, I'm going to negotiate. And I'm going to take advantage of the cultural. So I had a Seiko watch, and I had a digital watch, like for $10 at the time. And so I took off my Seiko watch, and I put on my digital watch, the one I dig in. And so I told them, I'd like to trade. I'd like to, trade my watch. And they said, yes. I didn't want to give the $100 Seiko watch versus the $10 one. And I held up the digital watch, and they looked at me like, that's $9.99. That's how much it's worth. And I'm like, no, this is an expensive. All of a sudden, they knew world economy, and they knew the difference between a Seiko watch and a digital watch. And I'm thinking like, okay, well, these are dumb Bedouin. I'm going to be able to, magic watch. And there I am realizing they knew that, and all of a sudden, it's like, 30 camels versus 32. That's cultural, and you negotiate for that. But then I come and I want to trade for some Bedouin jewelry, and boom, you're going to have to give me the great, barter system and the marketing system, what's going on in the streets, in the markets of Cairo. So the Bible is a Middle Eastern document. It's a Middle Eastern culture. So we have to assume that there's some cultural issues in choosing numbers. Symbolic. We know this theologically. There's symbolic numbers 7, 40, 3. And so when you get to 480 years, it's like, what does that number mean? Is it symbolic? Is it a measuring system? I'll give you an example, just using internal biblical evidence. Is it 480 years? Well, Paul's preaching at Pisidian Antioch, and he comes up, verses Acts 13, 15. After the reading of the law and the prophets, the synagogue officials sent to them, saying, "Brethren, if you have any word of exhortation for the people, say it." And this is the custom in the first century synagogues. You have visiting Jews coming in, and they ask if there's a word, if they have a reading. So Paul stood up and motioned with his hand and said, "Men of Israel, and you who fear God, listen. The God of this people, Israel, chose our fathers and made the people great during their stay in the land of Egypt, and with an uplifted arm, he led them out from it. For a period of about 40 years, he put up with them in the wilderness. When he had destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he distributed their land as an inheritance, all of which took about 450 years. After these things, he gave them judges until Samuel the prophet. Then they asked for a king, and God gave them Saul the son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, for 40 years. After he had removed him, he raised up David to be their king, concerning whom he also testified and said, I have found David the son of Jesse, a man after my heart, who will do all my will. From the descendants of this man, according to the promise God gave us both, God has brought to Israel a Savior, Jesus." So here's Paul giving a gospel presentation and talking about the whole history of the Jewish nation and how God has brought them to this point. And if we take the data from Paul, about 40 years, 450 years, we don't know Judges to Samuel. We'll just put 1 year there. 40 years of Saul, about 40 years David ruled, 4th year of Solomon, I'll just add 4 years. And there's a lot more here. Paul talks about the temple to the Exodus. It comes up to 574. Now, we can say preachers aren't good at math, so, Paul's just giving numbers here. But this is God's word. Paul is giving data, and he's using numbers. And I don't think he's messing up the numbers. I think there's later Jewish tradition that talks about the destruction of nations, about 450 years. I think 40 years is symbolic. But even when we take Paul, who's already, 1,000 years later, under a Greco-Roman accounting system, he's still using some type of numbers and systems to talk about Old Testament history. So what do we do now? Well, as I said, knowing the problems with the hermeneutical problems with numbers in the Bible, there's a lot of interpretations. You have to understand the cultural context, and there's a lot of context we just don't know. It's not preserved in history or in the biblical text. I tend to lead toward the 13th century because I'm not saying the number's wrong. God wanted 480 years there. We just don't understand how it fits chronologically. And there's been other, I can go through the various interpretations. Kenneth Kitchen talks about 12 times 40 gets to 480. It can just be a complete time. We use this culturally too. About a decade, 3 decades this happened. The decade of the 80s had bad clothes. It actually started in the 70s, but it's like We just kind of use, because we're a 10-based system, we use the decade to talk about a period of time. So, high view of God's word. I cannot change the biblical text. I'm not saying 480 is wrong. I know 15th century people will go say, well, they messed up the name of Ramses. They wanted to use another pharaoh, but they forgot the name, so they put Ramses there. And I'd have to introduce errors in the Bible. So I go, no, the biblical authors wanted Ramses there. Historicity events. I cannot change history. Some would try to find a Ramses in the 18th century. And it's just like there's no Ramses in the 18th century. We can't find a pharaoh. And Egypt has a good listing of the pharaohs. Therefore, my hermeneutical principle, the best theoretical reconstruction that accounts for the biblical text and the archaeology. So the biblical text, we have to choose which century, and I'll propose to you that there's enough data for the 13th century. And I got to end it there. I usually spend 2 weeks talking about the Exodus in class. And so when we come to the Exodus, we're looking for this short period of time. Besides the numbers in the Bible, the account of the Exodus really isn't presented in a linear fashion. It's over the Pentateuch. So the story, the emphasis, the message, the gospel, God brought us from slavery to the promised land. God's honoring his covenant and promise to Abraham, to his people. God's a God of deliverance. He hears the cry of his people and he sends a savior. God's holy. God's law is dominant. God demands obedience. These are general stories or accounts that we take away from the Exodus event, the message. Beneath that, we have a structure. And as I said, we have various literary approaches for what's going on in the Exodus. It would have been nice if they gave us a nice linear account and they just divided it up. Okay, the book of, Exodus is when they're in Egypt. The book of Leviticus, it's chopped up. There's a certain structure or a source. We can see administrative texts. How do you organize the tribes? Census list, religious texts, offerings and sacrifice, festivals and feast, worship, moral codes, all the stuff we ignore when we have our devotions or quiet time. It's like, oh, that's his data, I don't have to look. Civil laws, ceremonial laws, civil laws, autobiographies. We have the life of Moses. This is interesting. We have this Exodus itinerary, Numbers 33. It's just thrown there. It doesn't belong chronologically. And we kind of think, is this a summary? Well, the New Kingdom in Egypt had these day lists. So when a pharaoh went out to battle, like a diary, day 1, we attacked Gaza. We acquired 20 female slaves, 15 male slaves, 10 oxen, and 10 shekels of gold. Day 2, we crossed such and such river. Day 3, this event happened. Day 4, Ra blessed us and we attacked such and such a city. And it's just a list, a geographical list. Now this is great for historical geographers. It's great for historians because we look at these day lists and we're able to reconstruct events. So I know, Gaza is south of Ashkelon. And sure enough, we can take the Bible and these day lists and pretty much map out where events happen. And that's why we're confident, where a lot of the cities are located in the Bible. And it looks like they had a day list. Moses, a scribe, somebody mimicked the Egyptians. And this is what you do on a campaign. God has taken us through this, so we have a day list. And unfortunately, it's all the sites that aren't named after cities. This is where we grumbled. This is where we fought. This is where God zapped us. This is where the snakes attacked, it would have been nice if this is the place with the big rock that looks like, Pharaoh, or, So as archaeologists, we can go and find it. Where we fought can be anywhere, I have, when we first went to Israel, my wife and I, we went down south. And on the way to Beersheba, she got sick and she threw up. We had to get out of the car and she threw up. So whenever there's something Beersheba, she goes, "Where's Beersheba?" I go, "That's where you threw up." She goes, "Oh, okay, I know exactly where." So all her, when I give a lecture, she goes, "What are you talking about?" And I go, "This is where this happened," or this is where we, had the bad pizza. This is, and it reminds me of, these accounts. And so, let's just say archaeologically, we're not going to find these places. They were camps. And, Moses and the people could have fought God anywhere all along, and we know they fought a lot. So, as a historian of the events, I'm looking at those social and historical processes, events in time and space. So what do we know? Egyptian slavery and dominance by Egypt. Which historical period fits that? Egypt's decreasing frontier, i.e. Egypt is losing control over Canaan. What period does that fit? Migration of Semites, a mass migration. We have, it destroyed Egypt's economy. You had slaves moving out. So, again, we have enough data with Egypt to establish that. And then Transjordan tribal development. We do not have any evidence for the Exodus, archaeological evidence for the Exodus. We have evidence where they started, point A. We have evidence where they finished, point Z. So there's a lot of points in between. And we just don't have that. But we have enough data to see if the plausibility of the account. Now, keep in mind, the biblical authors were not interested in the Pharaoh of the Exodus. They were more interested in the God of the Exodus. Secondarily, biblical authors did not invent history. And a lot of critical scholars say the Exodus event is a created event. They're changing a little bit because the Bible is so ingrained with the Exodus that they have to come up with the time period. And for those Old Testament scholars, it's Shishak is like the new time period for this. They didn't invent it. It happened. They just interpreted it. And they interpreted it within the context of what God was telling them to do. So we don't find historical events in the archaeological record. We find patterns and material correlates, and we have to make inferences based on what caused these patterns. And I'm going to tell you about this social transformation. We have Canaan that was under Egypt, and all of a sudden in the 13th century, at the end of it, it was transformed, and we had a new group of people moving into the land. And that's where I'm proposing that the Exodus happened. Now, what evidence do we have? We have the geopolitics of Egypt and Israel. We have this social transformation in the Iron Age 1 period, the 12th century, right after the 13th century. Out of Sinai, the events that happened as they were wandering through Sinai, does it fit the geography? And then this last point, cultural memory, where the Bible is full of this event happening. So the geopolitics of Egypt and Israel. Again, I try to make it easier for you pastors in the audience. We can look at the capital, campaigns, control, and the collapse. Basic map of Egypt. You have Lower Egypt in the north, the Delta area, and then Upper Egypt up here in the Nile. And in this map, it's showing you the late Bronze Age, or between the 15th century to the end of the 13th century, or New Kingdom Egypt. And this is colored in because it means Egypt controlled this area. But this is where their main occupation was. Now we do have two datum points. We have the Hyksos period, and this is a period of about 1520 BC, where the Egyptians talk about these Semites who used to rule them, and they kicked them out of Egypt. Well, I don't have time for this. If I had more, I would talk about the patriarchs. But Semites ruling Egypt should remind you of Joseph ruling Egypt, being second in command. And so there's this memory where Egypt knew it was a negative history for them. It's not something they bragged about. This is a bad period of our time where non-Egyptians were ruling us. And so they just call it, and it's a difficult period. And then Merneptah Stela, 1220 BC, 1207, depending on your chronology. I'm leaning more toward 1207 now. But we have Merneptah mentioning Israel in somewhere in the Levant. So Merneptah encountered Israel outside of Egypt. So somewhere between 1220 and 1500 BC, we have to place this Exodus event. The capital, as I mentioned, 18th dynasty, it was in Upper Egypt. 19th dynasty, it was in Lower Egypt. Ramses establishes a new capital. Kantira Per Ramses is about 30 kilometers to the south of Tanis. All this is to say is basically in this area of Goshen where the Israelites were living. If Moses was here in Goshen, it'd be this small area here. He'd have to go all the way over here. And I don't know enough about my Canadian geography, but this would be like the capital was in Vancouver, and then they changed it to Edmonton. And so different periods. So, I drive everywhere, so I can't give walking distance. Campaigns. We have a lot of Egyptian campaigns marching through the Holy Land. Thutmose III had the first campaign. Thutmose I, his grandfather, kicked out the Hyksos. And we have later campaigns of Thutmose III. Basically, Egypt has a highway through the Holy Land, and they're marching through that highway. And we have a lot of historical records at the temple of Karnak. And all this temple we have, I mentioned one of my lectures, the name rings, where here they are, just listing all the cities they conquered. We can tell if it's Canaanite, they look Canaanite. If it's Nubian, they have a Nubian. And so they even give us the geo-ethnic pictographs of them. Here I am pointing to Gezer, which is the most important site in this region here, but that's, the site I excavate at, so, I like to show that Egypt knew Gezer was there. Seti I, end of the 18th dynasty, comes and conquers. And basically, take any Bible atlas, any Bible map, you're going to see Egypt has a full reign coming through. They control this area. Whenever you have rebellion, Egypt goes and tries to reestablish it. This is kind of what's going on now with the Russians. They want to reestablish the greater Soviet Union, so they're invading adjoining territories. Well, Egypt did the same thing. The Holy Land was part of its territory, and they're always going to regain it. And we have this throughout the Bible. When David and Solomon are strong, Egypt is weak. They're not able to come back. Once Solomon, the kingdom is divided, we have a Pharaoh coming up trying to reestablish control. And at this point, we have good history, and the Bible is recording these campaigns. But this is what's going on here. Why is this important? Because we have to find a time period where you have all these refugees, former slaves, in the land without Egyptian dominance. And we have their battles listed here. Here's Seti's campaign in Canaan, Bet-Shan. Ramses II, son of Seti I, has a major battle at Kedesh, Hittite Empire. He's gone past Syria already into modern Turkey. And so we can see each time we have a new pharaoh, they get more ground. They get more further north. And this is the extent of Egyptian rule. At the Hittites, it was a stalemate. Ramses said he won. The Hittites said they won. And, historians just say, okay, that's where they fought. The Hittites were able to hold off Ramses. And basically, Ramses owned all of the Holy Land. As I said, I think he's the Pharaoh of the Exodus. He was the greatest builder of the Egyptian pharaohs. After him, there was no greater dynasty of Egypt. And for me, theologically, that makes sense because he had this battle between Pharaoh, who's God in the Egyptian world, versus Yahweh. And after that battle, Egypt is no longer strong enough to regain it. And for my colleagues who put the Exodus in the 15th century, it's like, wow, if God defeated Pharaoh, Ramses is coming through and walking through the Holy Land, and we have no evidence of that in the biblical account. And so you can see why I think Ramses was the last greatest pharaoh, and we no longer see pharaohs coming through, except Merneptah, and I'll get to him in a second here. And his capital was built. He was a great builder. Even today, everything's named after him. You open up a taco stand, Ramses taco stand. Ramses, what did I eat this? A donaire, Ramses donaire, so it's Ramses taxi, Ramses hotel. In Cairo, you still see his statues. They're so big, they just build the roads around the statues. They can't move it. And so that's just the dominance from Upper Egypt to Lower Egypt, these large statues. And so you can see it even fits the history of the Exodus, of this great battle between Yahweh and Pharaoh, who thought he was God. And then we have one last campaign of the 19th dynasty, and it's Merneptah. Merneptah comes and attacks Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam, and then Israel. And I put two maps here because he's marching up the coast to attempt to regain control. And he comes to the Transjordan to control the King's Highway. And after conquering Yanoam, he encounters Israel. Well, some people say Israel's in the land. So in this map, it's like, well, he came back and attacked Israel. Israel's up in the hill country. I wrote an article with one of my students that Israel was actually coming up here still from the Exodus. And they're in Transjordan because any king is going to want to destroy the two major highways. And so Pharaoh is coming down the King's Highway, and that's where he encounters Israel. And we just have no mention of it in the biblical text. Now, it's a little bit hard because it's kind of a poetic structure. So in his great stela, he's kind of doing talking about the various larger nations and the smaller nations. And somewhere we have Israel in between. We have determinatives. So whenever you're a nation or a people with land, you draw mountains. So, here's one land, here's another land, the land of Canaan, the city of Ashkelon, they have their land. The only place that doesn't have land is Israel. And they give the determinative for people group. So even Merneptah knew they don't have a land yet, but they are somebody enough that I want to brag about them. Now the question is, why would Israel's never mentioned? Pharaohs never go and talk about this great nation. Gezer is a big city. In fact, Merneptah, in another monument, he calls himself the subduer of Gezer. You never talk about the U.S. invading Canada and we conquered Cochrane. What's the name of your city? Cochrane. Thank you. We're going to brag about Calgary. That's a bigger city. It's just like, yeah, anybody can conquer this little city. No offense to anybody. I'm just, trying to I realize, why I'm stepping in it now. But you see what I'm saying? Like, it's like they weren't a nation. They were a people group. And why is Merneptah going back to Egypt in putting this on his monument of how great he is. I have a theory. Your daddy got beat up by Yahweh. This Yahweh worshipers were the foundation of your economic, and now you have inflation. Now you have the elite complaining about buildings. Your daddy got beat up. He was the God. And now you have to come back to Egypt and you want to say, oh, by the way, I conquered Israel. His seed is not. And you come back and say, oh, the world is in order now because Israel no longer exists. Okay. Now, as a historian, it's just like, well, Israel still existed. His seed remained. And so some will say, well, the seed mentions that's agricultural land. So Pharaoh went and burned agricultural land. And now, I interpret it as seed, his offspring. You kill them, it's his offspring. Either interpretation is correct. We don't know what Bernapta was saying. But most Egyptologists see it as poetic. It's like, no, you're bragging about destroying them, that they're no more. And so that's why this little no-name place is prominent on the Karnak Temple. Now, we haven't found it. We have some reconstructions. We have the city of Ashkelon, and we have Gezer, and we think we have the feet of Israelites right up here. We're missing one top column here. And I mentioned this. This is one of our projects for our Egyptology project. We're documenting this battle. And boy, it should be nice if we found, some blocks somewhere that can finish it off. But it looks like after this city, there's some people up here that he conquered. Control. I talk about the Holy Land being under Egyptian control. In the late Bronze Age, 15th, 14th century, Egypt has the land divided. And each one of these is a city-state that controls a region. And we know about this because of the Amarna tablets. And these rulers of the city-states would write back to Egypt, and same formula, oh, great Pharaoh, I worship you, I bow down to you 5 times, I bow down to you 10 times. Taxes are going to be late this year. I'm only giving you half of my payment, of my tribute, because the governor of this other city is causing problems, and it'd be great if you can send me some soldiers to fight him off so I can continue to give you tribute. And so they're complaining why they're late with their tribute. They're complaining about other rulers. And however they're describing it, it shows that Egypt is in control, but they're starting to lose control. Because you shouldn't have governors, stealing from each other. It's like everybody should just be giving us tribute and money. And we have various reconstructions, but we can tell, various scholars are drawing the political lines, how far. Gezer was one of these governors. So we have tablets from the governor of Gezer going back. So when we excavated Gezer for 10 seasons, I tell students, look at this, memorize it, see if you can find one. Because surely the Pharaoh had to send a letter back to the city. And if we can just find, the administrative center, we'd have this documentation. But alas, students failed me, so, no. Even my staff, we couldn't find it. And you're not. This is the needle in a haystack. We probably have like 6 to 10 cuneiform tablets from the Middle Kingdom all the way to the later kingdom. Earlier projects have found part of a cuneiform fragment, but it's in the 7th century. And it shows the deportations of Israel, so it's for a later biblical period. So, anyway, and then we have Papyrus Anastasia that talks about Ramses ruling this land and completely controlling it. And so you see where I'm going. Egypt's ruling it, it's controlling it. We have periods where they're weak, but they still control it. And then Ramses is the last one that has control. We have his son trying to get control, but he doesn't. He has some battles. And then the next period we see everybody's moving. Historians talk about this 13th century collapse. the whole world falls apart. Now the sexy topic is climate change, and something happened in the 13th century. But it's a domino effect. The Hittite Empire collapses, the Minoan Empire collapses, and when you have refugees, they move to the next land, they conquer that land, and vice versa, and it's this general societal collapse. The great kingdoms fall apart, and they don't get established. And I find it ironic that historians talk about all this migration from the west coming to the lands, and this is part of the Philistines. Ramses III talks about the sea peoples coming. But when we talk about a migration of people from Egypt to the southern Levant, well, that's a myth, And like it happened at the same time. In God's sovereignty, you had this collapse. The new kingdom was part of this collapse, and it's all going through. And the new kingdom was specialized to this event of Yahweh. And now, in the 13th century, we have the history of the Eastern Mediterranean world. This power vacuum is created because the Hittites are weak, Britannia is weak, the new kingdom of Egypt is weak. And so what happens when the major players are gone? All the smaller secondary city-states develop. And the Philistines develop, the Edomites develop, the Israelites develop, and basically it's all these little powers racing to see who's going to control this land. And for the first part, it's the Philistines, and they're dominating the Israelites. And then the Israelites unite, they come under a charismatic leader, and under David and Solomon, we have a very short period where the Israelites dominated this whole land. But they weren't able to control it, and then we have the divided kingdom. So the geopolitics between Egypt and Israel, the southern Levant, fit, and it fits this 13th century. We can go to our second topic, the Iron Age 1 transformation. I'm quite proud of this little fancy stuff I'm doing here with this thing here. But Iron Age 1 transformation, settlements, houses, ethnic groups, material culture. I'm kind of overlapping with tomorrow's lecture, but I need to illustrate this. Late Bronze Age, Canaanite cities, and then all of a sudden, archaeologically, we're looking at settlement patterns. We have all these new settlements up in the hill country. We can look at it by number of sites or the built-up hectares. Either way, this goes from the 4th millennium BC, we have about 28 sites. Early Bronze Age, 86, EB 2 and 3, Iron Age. Middle Bronze Age, this is the age of the patriarchs, the Abrahamic period. This is migrations coming from the north. We have 248 sites, large city-states being built. And then after that boom, all of a sudden only 20 sites of the late Bronze Age. And this is where some of my colleagues want to place the Exodus, based on those two texts. But also in the Iron Age 1, 254. And now it's over 300, because this is an old article. I took this graph from it. I just don't have time to change it. And is that where the Exodus happened? No. But when we look at the settlements, it matches up. The patriarchs are strong. Where's everybody at? Well, there's a drought, the Egyptian sojourn. Everybody has gone back down to Egypt or up north to Mesopotamia. And then all of a sudden you have all these new sites. Well, this matches up a mass migration of refugees coming from somewhere. Now, granted, I can't say the Israelites coming out of Egypt. They could be, people coming from another part, people coming from Mesopotamia. But if we look at the material culture and we look at their ethnicity, we can postulate, no, these are Semites locally from the region that know this area. We have these new settlement patterns. And if you look at it, it's not a well-planned city. This still looks like a tribal society. Here's one clan, and then their kids get married and they're kind of built around grandpa. Here's another clan, but it's one city. This one's a little bit somewhat organized. You start to build in a center. This one, you can see the different plans. Notice this plan is different. It's well organized, perpendicular streets, well-planned city. This is not a hill country site. This is down on the coast. This is a Philistine city. And you can see the context of the biblical period under Samuel. We want a king like the Philistines. They have good sewer systems. They have a nice water system. They're organized. We're disorganized. Look at us. We can't, get our street system together. And different than the earlier late Bronze Age, 14th century cities. And you see where I'm going here. We got this new material culture. We talked about how archaeologists define pots and people. Again, I can't, quickly identify it, but with the housing studies, we have this typical 4-room house, a new style of house, various variations, but basically you have a back room, lengthwise, and then perpendicular to it, you have 3 areas here. And sometimes these areas are divided. You have pillars, courtyards, rooms built on top. Most of these are animal pens. Here's a nice reconstruction of a 4-room house. Animals are in the inside. This is where people store the animals. I'm going to propose Jesus in a manger. He wasn't out in the barn. He was in the household. There just wasn't room in the domestic quarter. So they were housed in the animal section of the house. You don't send family away and go live. They live inside the house. So in the first century, even Palestinians up to the Ottoman period still had houses this way. And you laugh, if I go to student housing or faculty housing here, you don't have animals in your house, but you have a car in your house. If you look at the plan, kids' bedrooms are over the car. That's your valuables. You want it inside. You want your car protected. Here in Canada, it's the code, but you protect it. Well, that's I don't want to say that's their car, but that's their valuables. You bring your valuables inside the household. And also it's easier when you get up in the morning, you can milk a goat and get the kids milk there without going outside. So that's how the houses were. This is an agricultural society, an agrarian society. We can look at other ethnic groups. I talk about this mass migration. The Philistines look different. We know where the cities are. We have pictographs of them from Egypt. We know their pottery. It's Aegean. Monochrome pottery comes from the Aegean world. This looks like Mycenaean pottery. This looks like Cypriot pottery. It's foreign pottery. We know the difference. And it's this short period of time. And it's after the 13th century, we have this new style of pottery. Philistine temples. Every Philistine site, we've pretty much found a temple, except Gaza. We haven't excavated enough. Pork. All of a sudden we see, here's the late Bronze Age. Here's where there's a lot of pork up north. All of a sudden, 12th century, 11th century, we call Iron One archaeologically. Look there's a lot of pork right there in the Philistine territory. Later on, 10th century, it kind of moves to Israel. And these are just, Israelites weren't done. They go bacon is really good. God, we've been so some of them have adopted pork. But we can see this social transformation. Boom, new food usage of pigs. And then, and naturally, this is the apostasy, or we can see the intermingling. We have it from the Samson story. Mom and dad, I think the Philistine girls are a lot nicer. I want to go marry one. And they're next to each other. He's going to weddings. The families are intermingling. It's this one area here. This is one of my studies that I'm doing in terms of, I talk about political borders between Philistia and Israel. We can see this border right here. And another thing is temples. Every city, every Canaanite city in the second millennium, that includes the Middle Bronze Age, the Late Bronze Age, the 15th century, 14th century, 13th century, has a temple in that city. 12th century, we have temples in the Philistine on the coast, but no temples up here in the heartland of Israel. Later on, the 10th century, we have the Arad Temple. But basically, these are all, I'm sorry, the red dots are all late Bronze Age temples. And then we only have, we have Bet Sha'an and Megiddo that are in the Israelite period, but this is in the land that yet remains. So we can look at Joshua where he says, this is the land we haven't conquered yet. It's still Canaanite territory. So we still have some temples of the Canaanites there. But up here, we have Mount Ebal, and I'll talk about that tomorrow with the Israelites, and this bull site. We have a lot of data on ethnic markers. I can't give a lecture on just Israelite ethnic markers, but trust me, we can start telling the differences between southern Judeans versus northern Israelites. Out of Sinai, we can study Sinai geography. And I'm going over here, but I'm going to go fast through this. We have a lot of data for Sinai. Geography of Sinai, the Sinai Peninsula, it's about 150 miles on the north, 260 miles along the triangle. We have the Gulf of Suez, the Gulf of Eilat. There are three main geographical areas, the coastal area, the Central Plateau, and then the Granite Mountains. So the location of Sinai, there's only two places a large group of people could live. Along the coast, because the water table is high, you can dig a well and get to fresh water, or up here in the Granite Mountains. And you can see from the satellite imagery, you can still see the mountains. Equifax, where do animals live? Southern Granite Mountains. Remember, they lived here for a year. So we have to look for an area that fits historically where a large group of people can camp out. Roads of Sinai, again, you have the main road, the way of the Philistines. They didn't take this route because they were scared of going down that route. But there's also the coastal route coming around. And there's one route, it's called the Pilgrims Route, going across the Central Plateau. There's not a lot of water there. It's called the Pilgrims Route because of the Hajj. So North Africa, they're going to Saudi Arabia. So it's more of a modern term with the rise of Islam. It's not, everybody thinks it's named after the Israelites, the pilgrims coming through. The Amalekites stopped them because the Amalekites knew, you're not coming down our territory. There's not enough land here for these refugees. So all that to say is they got shoved down to the south. Another issue is the location of Mount Sinai. There's about 23 locations, a lot more. I've just kind of given the major theories. Every PhD student from a seminary wants to come up with the real Mount Sinai, so they propose a new one. Basically, critical scholars say it's up here in the north. Since it's a made-up story, it's like, well, it's going to be in the nice area if you're going to make it up. Others that hold to the historicity either place it right here in the central or the northern Negev is a hot one where we have a lot of sites, or naturally on Mount Sinai. So this kind of influences where we put the route of the Exodus. And the Bible says they didn't go north lest they encounter the Philistines. You have the central one, the Amalekites stopped it, and the red is probably the most accurate one based on the geography. Context of the journey, as I said, we know where they started. We do have slave camps. I know Dr. Patterson, when he hired me, said, I would love to go dig in Egypt and find a slave camp. I told him, you're crazy. The delta is filled up with sand. It's about maybe 50 feet before we get to the level of a slave camp. The Nile has shifted, the branches of the Nile. So what we see today are different than what was during the Exodus. So you're going to pay me $1 million to dig a big hole and get down to the bottom and say it's not here. Okay, another $1 million, let's go down, we're guessing where it is. And I told him we already have pictures of other slave camps from other temples, so we know how a slave camp would look. We even have images of them making bricks. So the cultural ethos in the book of Exodus matches it. Here's modern brick making today. Similar to the ancient times, they just didn't have aluminum pot to mix the water. This looks like a Lipscomb staff meeting where my dean's just making me work and make bricks there. Chariots. Chariots were first introduced in warfare in the New Kingdom period. This matches the Exodus. And as I said, we do have some archaeological excavations in the Delta area. And we have some of the cities that are mentioned. Remember, they turned back, they took off, they got scared, they came back, and they had different sites. Pharaoh got up that morning and said, I changed my mind. Again, Pharaoh has to be in this area here, his capital. He can't be up in Thebes. Changed his mind and takes them a 10-day journey to get the troops down there. He's right next to the Israelites. He's supervising them building his capital down there. So somewhere in the 19th dynasty, we have to put the Pharaoh. I have a theory of the wall of water. This came after me because I'm a Katrina evacuee. So I was at New Orleans. My wife prayed to leave New Orleans. God heard her prayer. Everybody blamed George Bush. I've said this before, but it's my wife that caused Katrina. That's how we got to Texas, and so I'm glad she's a woman of prayer because I'm glad. But that morning, I called up. My brother-in-law lived in Texas, in Grapevine. That's where we fled. And called up and talked to a faculty member there. And he said, everything's okay. We lived on campus. And he said, there's no evidence of a hurricane. And I knew this because that season they were, going east. And I go, it's going to hit Mississippi. But we were made to evacuate. And so I said, okay, we're going to go home tomorrow. And classes started. I still needed to finish my syllabi. I went to Southwestern, the first time I've been on that campus, just to go visit it. I came home. My wife goes, have you been following the news? They go, New Orleans is flooded. And so by the time I left, like 10 o'clock, had lunch, with the faculty, a colleague, came back. And it's like, what happened? And you start to hear stories with neighbors and this faculty member. They had to run and they broke into student housing because they had 3 stories of student housing. And they basically had to break into somebody's apartment so they could sleep out that night. And it's like, didn't you leave? And they just came up so fast. And it's not like this, you see this flash flood. It just, all of a sudden the water just came up. And I go like, that's what happened to the miracle of the Exodus, that, the Pharaoh's army, so we're just going to drive our chariots. It wasn't like this water was coming through. Or you see this, these walls. Yeah, I think it was walls. I think it was water coming over the levees. And so it formed a wall. And so the poetic imagery was a wall of water. But basically and we have all these levee systems built around the New Kingdom. This is Ramses' capital. And we have these canals built. And basically God miraculously opened up a canal. The Israelites went through. Soldiers, this is normal. We're going through the canal. And they went through. I have to develop that more. But again, my mind has shifted after living through it. The journey, it fits. Quail nets today. Bedouin in northern Sinai still catch these quail. It's a natural location. Here's a central plateau. And again, wow, that looks like Mount Sinai. Any mountain looks like Mount Sinai. You have the oasis. Okay, you can fit some people here. And in the southern area, we have Hathor, who's the goddess of this area of mining here. And this is her image. She's a cow. So you have the Israelites in southern Sinai wondering, where's Yahweh? Who's the God of Sinai? Hathor. Moses isn't around. Let's build a golden calf. And it's like, well, no, they built Hathor. They were worshiping the Egyptian god that they would have been exposed to. Some of these Israelites would have worked the mines as slaves, and they would have said, yeah, let's not, offend the god of this region. And they built the Hathor. Skipping over Proto-Sinai, I have a whole story. This is Jebu Musa, Mount Sinai. And it's the traditional site. Truth be told, we can't tell which is it, but I say in all my lectures, this is the site. One, because I made my wife hike up it, and she'll kill me if I say, well, it might be another mountain. And so, but basically the southern Sinai, all these mountain ranges, and you all have to go there and hike up it. It's a phenomenal experience. Every time I've gone up there for the sunrise, you have different groups. Here's my buddy of mine, Jimmy. There's two of our couples. We're studying Israel, and we took our Easter break down in Sinai and hiking up to the summit. This is a little kiosk, 7-Eleven. They sell you sodas and candy. And you get up to the summit. There's my wife and Orly, Jimmy's wife, hiking up the summit there. And you get up to the top, you have another kiosk right here. And then you have another one there, a competing one. And there's the chapel built on top. And it's amazing. Sun comes up, and somebody starts singing a worship song in German, in Sweden, and we're all singing this song together. And I recognize the melody, and it's just like, this is amazing. You have so many nations here worshiping God, and somebody knows the same song, and so I've always, liked it when I've gone up during the tourist season. This is Mount Sinai. It's the largest mountain in the region. So some will say, well, that, God has to be on the largest mountain, so they put him there. But basically any mountain range, we don't know which one Moses went up, but somewhere in this region is Mount Sinai. And then we saw these donkeys going up, carrying cases of Coke and supplies to go supply the 7-Eleven up on top. And then they just came down. So they're all trained, the Bedouin, and then naturally St. Catherine to commemorate where the Israelites were. Again, this is a Byzantine custom. You have the priest, and you collect them. Here's the skulls. I've been in Baptist churches that look like this. A lot of dead people, but that's another lecture topic. What's funny here is you can go there and they'll show the tourists the burning bush. And about 200 years ago, the bush actually burnt, and they had to plant another one. So I just thought that's an interesting thing. It's nice to commemorate the event. And I started my lecture with bad archaeology. So there, again, the treasures there of early biblical manuscripts. And we know there's a lot more there. And I'm glad to see your display here. We just know that this is it. Anyway, I'm just illustrating that the geography, the ethos, the culture, the wanderings, the Bedouin lifestyle, these are not cities. These are people who do not live, they only leave footprints and they don't survive. And this is what we have to think about in terms of the Israelites. But if you look at the botanical information, the acacia tree, what they built the ark with, this matches. Even the tabernacle in the ark match. We have Egyptian pictures of New Kingdom, 19th dynasty, pharaohs marching out, and they build their camp, and it looks like this. Pharaoh is in the center. Basically, this is like the general's tent, and that's where they sit. And this only happens at the end of the Bronze Age, end of the second millennium, this one period. And what do the Israelites do? While Pharaoh, who's a god, he leads his people in battle. And we build a tabernacle there. And we also have an ark that the Pharaoh sits on. Now, Pharaoh is considered God, so they don't put Moses on the ark, they put Yahweh on the ark. And they're adopting an Egyptian cultural symbol of how do we go in battle? How does our God, lead us? If Pharaoh's the God and you build this type of structure, then Yahweh is our God. We're going to build this similar type of structure. This is the ark they found in King Tut's tomb. Pretty much matches the Egyptian description. The biblical description. And we have other Egyptian ones that you can see. And it's not in the 8th century, the 7th century, only in end of the 13th century. It just fits this one historical period. And I can go on and on, but I'm just going to end there. Location of manna. They eventually end up in the Promised Land, and this is where we're going to pick up tomorrow. Here's the view from Mount Nebo. We know the story. Moses is not allowed to go in. I think it's funny. The Jewish Moses is on this side in Jordan. The Muslim Moses is buried in Israel, the modern state of Israel proper. So Muslims, when they go to go visit the tomb of Musa, it's in Israel. When Israelis want to visit the tomb of Moses, it's in a Muslim country. And I just think God has a sense of humor. I don't know what the Catholic Church is doing. They're building trees here to block the view, so it looks nice now, but in 15 years, they're going to have to cut them so the tour buses can take their pictures of the view to the Promised Land. Not much is known, and I'll pick up the story tomorrow. Just want to end with this one phrase, the memory, and I won't get into this, but we can look at the biblical tradition, the term Hebrew. Everything we look at fits this as a historical event. This nation based their founding documents on this event and this cultural event, and they interpreted based on what God was doing with them, but they're taking all these cultural symbols that fit only this one historical period. So is there evidence for the Exodus? No, I'm not finding any camps. But if we place the account within what we know archaeologically, historically, Egyptian history, the geopolitics, it pretty much fits this 13th century period. And so I'll just connect with this, but also remind us that we serve a God who desires to bring us out of slavery into his promise. So thank you all for letting me go over and extend this. So thank you.